Hello everyone. I hope you're having a great day. Tonight's story begins in a grocery store where a black man is quietly followed, judged, and humiliated until a single moment forces the truth into the open. 10 years earlier, he saved a stranger's life, and that stranger is about to realize who he really is. If you enjoy powerful, thought-provoking stories, don't forget to subscribe and stay with us until the end. The automatic doors slid open with a soft mechanical hiss. Marcus Johnson stepped into the supermarket, the cool air brushing against his face as the smell of fresh bread and disinfectant mixed in the air. It was early evening in Los Angeles, California, the hour when the store was busy but not chaotic. Families filled carts after work. Elderly couples moved slowly down the aisles. Soft music played overhead, meant to be calming. Marcus adjusted the strap of his reusable bag over his shoulder and took a shopping basket. His movements were unhurried, deliberate. He wore a dark jacket, simple jeans, clean sneakers, nothing flashy, nothing careless. Just a man doing his weekly grocery run. What he didn't know was that the moment he stepped inside, eyes locked onto him. From near the security desk, Daniel Whitaker looked up. Daniel was 45, white, broad-shouldered, wearing a navy blue security vest with the supermarket logo stitched neatly on the chest. He had worked here for almost 7 years. He told himself he was good at his job, alert, cautious, experienced. And the instant Marcus entered, something in Daniel tightened. His eyes followed Marcus automatically. Too automatically. Marcus moved toward the produce section, picking up a head of lettuce, checking it carefully before placing it into his basket. Daniel pretended to organize pamphlets near the entrance, but his gaze never left Marcus's hands. Watch him, Daniel told himself, just in case. Marcus felt it. He didn't turn around, didn't stiffen, didn't change his pace, but he felt that familiar pressure between his shoulders, the invisible weight of being observed too closely, too deliberately. It wasn't new. He had learned long ago how to recognize it without acknowledging it. He continued down the aisle. Cereal, rice, pasta. Daniel began moving too. Not directly behind Marcus. That would be obvious. Instead, he took parallel paths, appearing at the end of aisles just as Marcus entered them. Straightening shelves that didn't need straightening. Adjusting products already aligned. Every time Marcus reached for an item, Daniel's eyes followed the movement. Hands, bag, pockets. Marcus picked up a box of pasta, read the label, then placed it back and chose another brand. He felt the gaze sharpen, as if the simple act of comparison itself was suspicious. Around them, other customers began to notice. A woman paused mid-step, glancing from Marcus to Daniel and back again. A teenage boy nudged his friend and whispered something. The tension was quiet, but it spread like a low hum. Marcus stopped at the refrigerated section and opened the door for milk. The glass reflected him, and behind him, several feet back, Daniel. Their eyes met in the reflection for half a second. Daniel looked away first. Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Stay calm, he reminded himself. Get what you need. Leave. He reached for a carton of milk. Behind him, Daniel touched the radio clipped to his vest but didn't press it. He didn't need backup. Not yet. He just needed to be sure. Marcus moved on. Frozen foods. Cleaning supplies. Each step felt heavier than the last, not because of fear, but because of restraint. The restraint of someone who knew that any sudden movement, any sharp word, any sign of irritation could be misinterpreted. He had learned that lesson years ago. Daniel, meanwhile, felt justified. I'm just doing my job, he told himself. Better safe than sorry. He noticed how Marcus scanned the store before turning corners, how he paused slightly when other customers got too close. To Daniel, these were signs. To Marcus, they were survival habits. At the end of aisle 7, Marcus stopped to check his list. Daniel stopped too, pretending to adjust a display of canned soup. The distance between them was less than 10 feet now. A child ran past, laughing. A cart squeaked loudly. Normal sounds, normal life. And yet, the tension remained. Marcus folded the list and placed it back into his pocket. He took a breath, slow and controlled, then headed toward the checkout lanes. Daniel followed. At this point, there was no pretense left. Customers noticed openly now. Heads turned. Conversations dropped in volume. Marcus placed his items on the conveyor belt. Milk, bread, vegetables. Nothing expensive, nothing unusual. The cashier smiled politely at Marcus, then glanced nervously at Daniel standing just off to the side. Marcus didn't look at Daniel. He focused on the beeping scanner, on the simple, ordinary act of paying for groceries. But inside, a quiet question echoed, one he had asked himself too many times before. What exactly do you think I'm about to do? Daniel crossed his arms. He told himself this was routine. But something about Marcus unsettled him, not in a threatening way, but in a way he couldn't explain. Marcus didn't fidget, didn't rush, didn't avoid eye contact with the cashier. He stood there with quiet dignity. And for reasons Daniel didn't yet understand, that made him more suspicious. As the cashier announced the total, Daniel took a step closer. The sound of his shoes against the floor was loud enough that Marcus finally turned his head slightly. Their eyes met directly for the first time. Marcus's gaze was calm, steady, unafraid. Daniel opened his mouth to speak, and in that moment, just before a single word was said, the entire store seemed to hold its breath. If you're listening, stay with this story. Subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever felt judged before anyone even knew who you were? Because in the next scene, a single sentence will turn silent suspicion into public humiliation, and neither man will walk away unchanged. Daniel Whitaker didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The moment he stepped closer to Marcus Johnson, the air around the checkout lane tightened. Conversations nearby slowed. The cashier's hands paused above the register. A woman 2 lanes over leaned slightly forward, pretending to look at candy bars while clearly listening. Daniel cleared his throat. "Sir," he said, tone measured, professional on the surface, "before you complete your purchase, I need to ask you a few routine questions." Marcus didn't respond immediately. He stood still, hands resting calmly on the edge of the counter. His reflection stared back at him from the metal surface of the conveyor belt, his own face composed, eyes steady, shoulders relaxed. "What kind of questions?" Marcus asked quietly. Daniel nodded toward the reusable bag hanging from Marcus's shoulder. "I'll need you to open that bag." The cashier's eyes widened slightly. A man behind Marcus shifted uncomfortably. For a brief moment, Marcus considered refusing. He knew his rights. He knew the law. He knew that he had done nothing wrong. But he also knew something else. He knew how this usually ended. So instead of arguing, Marcus slowly lifted the bag from his shoulder and placed it on the counter. His movements were careful, deliberate, non-threatening. Daniel watched every inch of the motion. Marcus unzipped the bag and opened it wide. Inside were only the items Marcus had just paid for: a folded jacket, a notebook, a water bottle. Nothing hidden, nothing suspicious. Daniel leaned in, scanning the contents as if something might magically appear if he stared long enough. Nothing did. The silence stretched. Other customers stared openly now. A teenage girl whispered something to her mother. The mother hushed her, eyes still fixed on Marcus. The cashier swallowed. Is everything okay?" she asked Daniel hesitantly. Daniel straightened, his jaw tightening. Just protocol. Marcus felt heat rise in his chest, not anger exactly, but something heavier, something tired. He closed the bag slowly and zipped it back up. "Are we done?" Marcus asked. Daniel hesitated. He hadn't found anything. He should step back. He should apologize. Instead, he said, "I'll also need to check your receipt." Marcus exhaled softly through his nose. Without a word, he reached into his pocket and handed over the receipt. Daniel studied it carefully, tracing each item with his finger as if hoping for a mistake. He compared it to the groceries on the belt. Milk, check. Bread, check. Vegetables, check. Everything matched. Around them, the store felt frozen in time. Marcus's hands clenched briefly, then relaxed. The cashier shifted her weight, clearly uncomfortable. Daniel finally handed the receipt back. "You're clear," he said. No apology, no explanation, just 2 words. Marcus took the receipt and folded it neatly. He picked up his basket and bag, nodding once, not in thanks, but in acknowledgement that the moment was over. As he turned to leave, Daniel spoke again. "Sir," he said. Marcus stopped. "Yes," he replied, turning slowly. Daniel hesitated, then said, "You understand we have to be careful." Marcus met his eyes. "Careful of what?" Marcus asked calmly. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it. The question hung in the air, unanswered and uncomfortable. Marcus waited a moment longer. Then he nodded once and walked away. The automatic doors opened and closed behind him, swallowing his exit with a quiet hiss. Inside the store, the atmosphere slowly returned to normal, but something had shifted. The cashier let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "That wasn't right," she muttered to no one in particular. Daniel stood frozen near the checkout, staring at the doors Marcus had just walked through. His chest felt tight, not with relief, with confusion. He replayed the interaction in his mind, the calm voice, the steady eyes, the way Marcus hadn't argued or protested. Most people would have reacted, Daniel thought. Anger, defensiveness. Marcus hadn't. And for reasons Daniel couldn't yet explain, that bothered him more than if Marcus had. A few minutes later, Daniel forced himself to move. He returned to the security desk, picked up a clipboard, pretended to review paperwork. But his attention kept drifting. To the sound of Marcus's voice, to its steadiness, to the way it had triggered something deep and uncomfortable in his chest. A memory stirred, faint at first. Rain, darkness, a voice telling him, "Stay with me. Don't close your eyes." Daniel shook his head slightly, as if to clear it. "No," he told himself, "that's impossible. 10 years was a long time." Faces blurred, voices faded, and yet, across the parking lot, Marcus placed his groceries in his trunk. He paused before closing it. For a brief moment, he rested his hand on the edge of the car and closed his eyes. Not because he was shaken, because he was tired. Tired of moments like this stacking up quietly over a lifetime. Tired of choosing silence because it was safer than speaking. Tired of being made into a question mark in places where he had done nothing but exist. He opened his eyes, closed the trunk, and got into his car. As he drove away, he didn't look back. Inside the store, Daniel watched through the glass as Marcus's car disappeared into traffic. The unease in his chest grew stronger. He didn't know why, not yet. But somewhere deep in his memory, a door had cracked open. And what waited behind it was not suspicion. It was recognition. If you're listening, stay with this story. Subscribe to the channel and leave a comment. Have you ever stayed silent just to survive a moment of injustice? Because in the next scene, a single sound, a single memory, will force Daniel to confront a truth he has spent 10 years running from. Daniel Whitaker couldn't focus for the rest of his shift. He stood behind the security desk, pretending to review camera feeds, but the images blurred together. His mind replayed a single moment again and again, the calm voice at the checkout line. "Are we done?" There was no anger in it, no sarcasm, just quiet control. That was what disturbed him most. Most people, when confronted the way he had confronted Marcus Johnson, reacted defensively. Some raised their voices. Some argued. Some tried too hard to explain themselves. Marcus had done none of that. Daniel rubbed his temples and leaned back in his chair. Why does that bother me? He wondered. He glanced at the security monitors. Aisle 5, produce, checkout lanes, normal activity, no threats, no thefts. And yet, his chest felt tight. The store manager walked past and glanced at him. Everything okay? Daniel forced a nod. Yeah, just a long day. But it wasn't the day. It was the memory pushing its way to the surface. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, and suddenly, the supermarket sounds faded. 10 years earlier. Night. Rain slammed against a windshield so hard it felt like the world itself was cracking. Daniel, 35 at the time, gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, headlights barely cutting through the storm on a highway outside Los Angeles. He didn't see the other car until it was too late. Metal screamed, glass exploded. The world spun violently, then stopped. Silence followed, thick and terrifying. Daniel came to with pain everywhere. His legs were pinned, his chest burned. Blood trickled down his temple, warm and sticky. He tried to move. Nothing happened. Panic surged. "Help!" he croaked, his voice barely audible over the rain pounding the twisted metal. The world outside the shattered windshield was chaos, flashing hazard lights, distant horns, rain soaking everything. Then footsteps. Fast. Urgent. A shadow appeared beside the car. "Hey," a voice said, low, steady, commanding. "Stay with me. Don't move." Daniel blinked, trying to focus. The man leaned closer. Daniel couldn't see his face clearly, only dark skin glistening with rain, strong hands bracing against the door. "Can you hear me?" the man asked. Daniel nodded weakly. "Good," the voice said. "I'm going to get you out. Just breathe. Look at me. Stay awake." The man didn't panic, didn't shout. He spoke like someone who knew exactly what to do. Daniel remembered that more than anything else. The calm, the control, the reassurance. He remembered hands breaking glass, the sharp sound, the pain. Then strong arms pulling him free just as sirens approached in the distance. "Hey," the voice said again, closer now. "You're going to be okay." Daniel tried to thank him, but the darkness took over. When Daniel woke up in the hospital days later, the man was gone. No name, no face, just a voice burned into his memory. Back in the supermarket, Daniel's eyes snapped open. His heart pounded. He looked at his hands. They were shaking. "That's impossible," he told himself. "It's been 10 years. People changed. Voices changed. Memories distorted." And yet, Marcus's voice at the checkout line had cut through him like a knife. Daniel stood abruptly, chair scraping against the floor. He needed air. He stepped outside the store, rain beginning to fall lightly, enough to send a chill down his spine. The sound of it triggered something else. He leaned against the wall and closed his eyes again. The memory returned stronger now. The rescuer's voice had been calm even as the rain poured. Marcus's voice had been calm even as the store watched him. Daniel swallowed hard. No, he thought. It can't be him. Why would a man who saved a stranger's life end up being humiliated in a grocery store 10 years later? The idea made his stomach turn. Daniel returned inside, his gaze searching instinctively for Marcus, already knowing he wouldn't find him. Instead, he saw the checkout lane, the exact spot where Marcus had stood, the place where Daniel had asked him to open his bag, the place where he had treated a hero like a suspect. A wave of nausea hit him. "What if?" Daniel whispered under his breath. The store manager approached again. "Daniel, you okay? You look pale." Daniel nodded stiffly. "I need a break." In the staff room, Daniel sat alone, head in his hands. He thought about the question Marcus had asked him. Careful of what? Daniel hadn't answered because he didn't have a good one. He had filled the silence with assumptions, and now those assumptions were cracking. He stood suddenly. "I need to find him," Daniel muttered. But he didn't know Marcus's name, didn't know where he lived. All he had was a voice and a memory. Then something occurred to him. Daniel rushed back to the security desk and pulled up the camera footage from the checkout lane. He rewound it, focusing not on Marcus's hands, but on his face. He paused the video. Marcus's expression was clear now. Calm, focused, unafraid. The same expression the man at the accident scene had worn as rain poured down. Daniel's breath caught. "That's him," he whispered. His chest tightened painfully, not with fear, but with shame. 10 years ago, a black man had pulled him from a crushed car and disappeared without expecting anything in return. Today, that same man had stood in front of him, and Daniel had repaid him with suspicion. The weight of that realization crushed down on him. Daniel leaned back in his chair, staring at the frozen image on the screen. "I followed you," he said quietly, as if Marcus could hear him. "I humiliated you." His throat burned. He stood again, determination replacing disbelief. "I'm not letting this end like that," he said. "If you're listening, stay with this story. Subscribe to the channel and leave a comment. What would you do if you realized too late that you had judged the very person who once saved your life? Because in the next scene, fate will intervene again, and Marcus's actions will force Daniel to confront the truth publicly, whether he's ready or not. Marcus Johnson had almost reached the exit of the parking lot when he heard it. A sharp, hollow sound. Then a scream. "Someone help!" He braked instinctively. Across the lot, near the entrance of the supermarket, an elderly man had collapsed beside a shopping cart. The cart tipped over, groceries spilling across the asphalt. A small crowd formed instantly, but no one moved close enough to touch him. Marcus didn't hesitate. He parked crookedly, threw his door open, and ran. "Sir," Marcus said firmly as he knelt beside the man. "Can you hear me?" The man's eyes were open but unfocused. His breathing was shallow, uneven. Marcus placed 2 fingers against the man's neck. Weak pulse. Rapid. "Call 911, Marcus said loudly, without looking up. "Now!" Someone fumbled for a phone. Inside the supermarket, Daniel Whitaker heard the commotion through the open doors. He looked up from the security desk and saw Marcus sprinting back toward the building. For a split second, Daniel's first instinct was wrong. What's he doing now? Then he saw the crowd. Then he saw the man on the ground. And then, something clicked. Daniel ran. By the time Daniel reached the scene, Marcus was already in control. "Sir, stay with me," Marcus said, his voice calm and commanding. "Don't try to move." He loosened the man's collar, carefully rolled him slightly onto his side, checking his airway. His movements were precise, practiced, nothing hesitant, nothing reckless. Daniel stopped short, frozen. That voice, that exact tone, it was the same one from the rain-soaked highway 10 years ago. "Marcus," Daniel whispered, though he still didn't know his name. The elderly man coughed weakly. "That's it," Marcus said. "Keep breathing. Help is coming." A woman nearby was crying. "Is he going to die?" Marcus looked up at her, steady and reassuring. "He's breathing. That's good. We're not losing him." Daniel felt his throat close. This wasn't coincidence anymore. This was confirmation. Daniel pushed through the small crowd. I'm trained in CPR," he said, his voice unsteady. Marcus glanced up at him briefly. Their eyes met again. This time, something passed between them. Recognition on one side, confusion on the other. "Then help me keep people back," Marcus said simply. "Give him space." Daniel nodded immediately. "Yes, yes, of course." He raised his hands. "Everyone, please step back. Give him air." Sirens wailed faintly in the distance. As they waited, Marcus continued speaking to the man, grounding him with his voice. The same calm cadence, the same words Daniel remembered hearing when he himself had been trapped and fading. Daniel felt sick. 10 years ago, Marcus had knelt beside him in the rain. Now Marcus knelt again, saving another stranger, while Daniel stood there, confronted with the truth of his own actions minutes earlier. The paramedics arrived quickly, taking over with practiced efficiency. They loaded the man onto a stretcher. One paramedic looked at Marcus. "You did the right things. Thank you." Marcus nodded. "He's lucky." As the ambulance doors closed and sirens faded, the crowd slowly dispersed. Daniel remained rooted to the spot. "Marcus," he said again, louder this time. Marcus turned. "Yes?" Daniel swallowed hard. His mouth felt dry. "I owe you an apology," Daniel said. Marcus studied him calmly. "For what?" Daniel gestured weakly toward the checkout lanes, visible through the glass doors. "For earlier. For how I treated you." Marcus didn't respond immediately. "I was wrong," Daniel continued, voice cracking slightly. "I made assumptions. I embarrassed you." The words felt too small. Marcus looked at him for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "I noticed." Daniel flinched. "I'm sorry," Daniel said again. "And I think I know you." Marcus frowned slightly. "You do?" Daniel nodded, eyes glassy. 10 years ago. A car accident. On the highway. You pulled me out of a wrecked car in the rain." Marcus froze. The parking lot seemed to fall away around them. "You survived?" Marcus asked softly. Daniel laughed weakly, a sound caught halfway to a sob. "Because of you." For the first time, something cracked in Marcus's calm exterior. Not anger, not bitterness, but surprise. "I didn't know," Marcus said. "I left when the sirens came." Daniel nodded. "I never got to thank you." Silence stretched between them, heavy and charged. "And today," Daniel continued, voice thick with shame, "I treated you like a suspect." Marcus exhaled slowly. "Yes," he said. Daniel bowed his head. "I don't expect forgiveness." Marcus considered him. "You shouldn't," Marcus replied. Daniel nodded, accepting the words without defense. Around them, a few lingering customers watched from a distance, sensing the gravity of the moment. "I want to make this right," Daniel said. "Publicly. Properly." Marcus shook his head slightly. "This isn't about appearances." Daniel looked up. "Then what is it about?" Marcus met his gaze. "Learning." Daniel swallowed. "Then teach me." Marcus studied him for a long moment. Then he said, "Start by asking yourself why you followed me." Daniel didn't answer right away, because now, in the open air, with the truth laid bare between them, there was nowhere left to hide from that question. If you're listening, stay with this story. Subscribe to the channel and leave a comment. Should forgiveness be given when someone finally understands the harm they caused? Because in the next scene, Daniel will have to answer that question not in private, but in front of everyone who watched him judge a man who once saved his life. The supermarket did not return to normal, not after what had just happened. Customers lingered near the entrance, pretending to browse their phones or rearrange groceries, but no one was really shopping anymore. They were watching, listening, waiting. Marcus Johnson stood beside a concrete pillar near the cart return, his grocery bag resting at his feet. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were alert. He had lived long enough to know that moments like this, moments when truth surfaced unexpectedly, could go in many directions. Daniel Whitaker stood a few steps away, hands clasped tightly in front of him, shoulders stiff. The uniform he had worn with confidence earlier now felt heavy, almost foreign. "I followed you," Daniel said quietly, repeating Marcus's question from moments before. "Because I thought I had to." Marcus looked at him, expression unreadable. "Had to, because of what?" Daniel swallowed. He glanced around, aware now that the small crowd was no longer subtle. "Because I saw you and assumed risk," Daniel said. "I told myself it was experience, training, instinct." He shook his head slowly. "But it wasn't." Marcus didn't interrupt. "It was fear," Daniel continued, "and bias." The word hung in the air. A woman near the door crossed her arms tightly. A man standing by the soda machine shifted his weight. Daniel took a shaky breath. 10 years ago, when I was trapped in that car, I didn't think about race. I didn't think about danger. I just heard a voice telling me to stay awake. He looked at Marcus. "Your voice." Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "And today," Daniel said, voice breaking slightly, "I ignored that same voice because I saw your skin before I saw you." Silence. The kind that presses against the ears. The store manager, a woman in her early 50s, stepped forward cautiously. "Daniel," she said, "maybe we should take this inside." Daniel shook his head. "No. This already happened in public." He turned back to Marcus. "I want to apologize," Daniel said. "Not quietly, not privately, but here, where everyone saw what I did." Marcus studied him carefully. "You want absolution," Marcus said calmly. Daniel nodded. "I want accountability." Marcus considered that. Then he reached down and picked up his grocery bag. "You followed me because you thought you were protecting something," Marcus said. "Order, safety, control." Daniel nodded again. "But what you were protecting," Marcus continued, "wasn't the store. It was your comfort." A murmur rippled through the onlookers. Marcus met Daniel's eyes, and my discomfort was the cost. Daniel bowed his head. "Yes," he said. Marcus took a breath. "I don't need an apology to feel whole," Marcus said. "I've lived with moments like this my entire life." Daniel flinched. "But," Marcus continued, "you asked how to make this right." Daniel looked up. "Yes." "Then don't make me the lesson," Marcus said. "Make yourself one." The words landed hard. The store manager stepped forward again. "Marcus, I want to say, on behalf of the store, we're sorry." Marcus nodded politely. "Thank you." Daniel turned to her. "I should be written up," he said. The manager blinked. "Daniel." "I should face consequences," Daniel insisted, "if this is going to mean anything." The crowd stirred again. The manager hesitated, then nodded slowly. "We'll review this." Daniel exhaled, accepting it. Marcus looked at him one last time. "I saved you 10 years ago because you were a human being in danger," Marcus said quietly. "Not because of who you were." Daniel nodded, tears now openly spilling. "I know." Marcus lifted his bag. "I hope you remember that." With that, Marcus turned and walked toward his car. No applause, no dramatic exit, just dignity. As Marcus drove away, Daniel stood alone in the parking lot, the weight of the moment settling fully on his shoulders. Inside the store, the manager turned to the remaining customers. "We're going to take a short pause," she announced. "Thank you for your patience." People began to leave, whispering softly. Daniel returned to the security desk and sat down heavily. For the first time in years, he didn't feel defensive. He felt exposed. And that, he realized, was necessary. Later that evening, Daniel removed his uniform and placed it carefully in his locker. He didn't know if he would be wearing it again, but he knew something else. He would never forget the sound of Marcus's voice. Not because it had saved his life once, but because it had forced him to see it differently. If you're listening, stay with this story. Subscribe to the channel and leave a comment. Can accountability exist without forgiveness? Because in the next scene, the consequences will ripple outward, and Marcus's quiet strength will leave a mark far beyond a single supermarket. News travels fast in a city like Los Angeles, not through headlines at first, but through whispers, short videos, and half-recorded moments shared without context. Someone in the supermarket had filmed part of what happened, not the accusation at the checkout, not the quiet humiliation, but the moment in this parking lot, Daniel Whitaker standing stiff and shaken, Marcus Johnson calm and unflinching. The words, "I followed you because I was afraid," faintly audible beneath the noise of traffic. By the next morning, the clip had spread. It didn't go viral in the loud, explosive way scandals usually did. It moved slowly, deliberately, carried by people who recognized the tension immediately. The comment sections filled with familiar lines, some supportive, some defensive, some angry. Marcus didn't see any of it at first. He woke before dawn, as he always did, brewed coffee, and sat at the small kitchen table in his apartment. The morning light filtered in through thin curtains. Quiet, ordinary. He checked his phone. Missed calls. Unknown numbers. A message from an old friend. "You okay? Just saw a video. That was you, right?" Marcus frowned and opened the link. He watched the clip once, then again. He didn't flinch. What unsettled him wasn't what Daniel said. It was how many people were shocked by it, as if this kind of moment was new, as if it wasn't happening every day, just without cameras. Marcus set the phone down. He wasn't angry. He was tired. Across town, Daniel Whitaker sat in his car outside the supermarket, gripping the steering wheel. He hadn't gone inside yet. He knew what waited for him. Emails from corporate, a meeting with management, questions he could no longer deflect. His phone buzzed, a message from his sister. "I saw the video. I'm glad you said something." Daniel closed his eyes. "I should have done more," he whispered to himself. At the store, the atmosphere was heavy. Daniel was called into the manager's office within minutes of clocking in. Corporate representatives joined on a video call. The conversation was careful, measured, but firm. "Your actions violated our internal conduct standards," one representative said, regardless of intent. Daniel nodded. "I understand." "This will go on your record," another added. "You'll be suspended pending review." Daniel didn't argue. "I accept that," he said. The call ended. Daniel sat alone in the office, staring at the blank wall. For the first time, he didn't feel defensive. He felt responsible. That afternoon, Marcus returned to the supermarket, not to shop, to return a reusable container he'd forgotten in his trunk. He hesitated before entering, then pushed the doors open. The store fell quiet again, but not with tension this time, with recognition. A cashier looked up and smiled softly. "Hi." A woman near the bakery nodded. "Good afternoon." Marcus nodded back. He returned the container to customer service, thanked them, and turned to leave. That was when he saw Daniel. Daniel stood near the front, no uniform this time, just a plain jacket and tired eyes. He hesitated, then approached. "I didn't expect to see you," Daniel said quietly. "I didn't expect to come back," Marcus replied. They stood a few feet apart. "I'm suspended," Daniel said. "Not as an excuse, just a fact." Marcus nodded. "Actions have weight." Daniel swallowed. "I wanted you to know. I'm not angry about it." Marcus studied him. "That's good." Daniel took a breath. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about comfort. Marcus waited. I built my idea of safety around control, Daniel continued. And when I felt that slipping, I blamed you. Marcus nodded slowly. That stops now, Daniel said. Marcus met his gaze. I hope so. Daniel hesitated, then added, If you're willing, I'd like to buy you coffee. Not to apologize again, just to listen. Marcus considered the offer. Then he nodded. 1 coffee. They walked to a small cafe across the street. No one recognized them there. No cameras. Just 2 men sitting across from each other. The past heavy, but no longer unspoken. I didn't save you to be thanked, Marcus said quietly. I saved you because I could. Daniel nodded. I know. And I didn't stand there calmly today because I'm strong, Marcus continued. I stood there because I've had practice. Daniel looked down. That shouldn't be something anyone gets used to, Daniel said. Marcus didn't answer, because sometimes the truth didn't need agreement to be real. When they stood to leave, Daniel said, I won't forget this. Marcus paused. Make sure you don't forget the next person either. Daniel nodded. That evening, Marcus sat on his balcony, watching the city lights flicker on. The video continued to spread. People debated, argued, defended. But somewhere in that noise, something quieter was happening. People were listening. If you're listening, stay with this story. Subscribe to the channel and leave a comment. Should moments like this be recorded, or should change happen quietly? Because in the next scene, the ripple will reach farther than either man expected, and Marcus will discover that dignity, once seen, cannot be unseen. Marcus Johnson did not want to become a symbol, but symbols don't ask permission. By the 3rd day, the video had spread far beyond Los Angeles. It appeared on morning news segments, online forums, and quiet group chats between people who recognized themselves in the moment, on one side or the other. The clip was short, incomplete, but powerful. Marcus standing still. Daniel admitting fear. The truth cutting through a routine place. Commentators filled in the gaps with their own narratives. Some called Marcus a hero. Others accused Daniel of being one bad apple. A few insisted the moment was being overblown. Marcus avoided all of it. He went to work. He went to the gym. He cooked dinner. He lived his life with the same quiet discipline he always had. But the world around him had changed. At work, a colleague pulled him aside. That was you? Marcus nodded. The man hesitated. I've seen things like that happen. I just never said anything. Marcus met his eyes. You can start now. The man nodded slowly. Across the city, Daniel Whitaker sat in his apartment, laptop open, watching himself on the screen. Not the version of himself he'd believed in. The one exposed. Corporate had released a statement, carefully worded, legally sound. Daniel read it once and closed the page. He wasn't looking for defense. He was looking for understanding. His phone rang. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. This is Daniel. A pause. Mr. Whitaker, a calm female voice said. This is a producer from a local news station. We'd like to ask you about what happened at the supermarket. Daniel closed his eyes. Yes, he said, but only if Marcus Johnson is asked too. There was another pause. We haven't been able to reach him. Then don't air it, Daniel replied. This isn't my story alone. The line went quiet. We'll see what we can do, the producer said finally. Daniel hung up. That evening, Marcus received an email, not from the media, from a man named Thomas Reed. The subject line read, 10 years ago, you saved my brother too. Marcus stared at the screen. The email was brief. Thomas described a highway accident, different location, same storm. A stranger who broke a window, pulled his brother free, disappeared before help arrived. "You never stayed for thanks," the email read, "but my brother is alive because of you." Marcus leaned back in his chair, breath slow. He hadn't known. How could he? That night, Marcus finally watched the news. Not to see himself, but to see what people were doing with the moment. The anchor spoke calmly. "This incident has sparked a broader conversation about implicit bias and everyday discrimination." Marcus turned off the television. The conversation wasn't new, but this time it had a face. And it wasn't angry. It was quiet. The next morning, Marcus's phone rang again. This time, it was Daniel. "I know you didn't ask for this," Daniel said quietly. Marcus sighed. "No. I want to say something publicly," Daniel continued, "not to explain myself, not to soften it." Marcus listened. "I want to say I was wrong," Daniel said. "Completely. And that this isn't about one moment, it's about a pattern." Marcus considered his words. "And what happens after you say it?" Marcus asked. Daniel didn't answer immediately. "I keep saying it," Daniel said finally, "even when no one's watching." Marcus nodded slowly. "Then do it," Marcus said, "but don't use my name as cover." Daniel swallowed. "I won't." Later that day, Daniel stood alone in front of a camera. No uniform, no script, just him. "I followed a man in a grocery store because of fear I didn't want to admit," he said plainly. "And that man once saved my life. I didn't deserve his patience, but I'm grateful for it." He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't center himself. He spoke and stopped. The response was immediate. Some praised him. Some criticized him. But something shifted. People began sharing their own moments of silence, moments they wished they'd handled differently. Marcus watched the clip once, then turned it off. He didn't feel satisfaction. He felt resolve. That evening, Marcus walked past the same supermarket. He didn't go inside. He didn't need to. The place no longer held power over him. What mattered now was what people carried with them when they left. If you're listening, stay with this story. Subscribe to the channel and leave a comment. Do moments like this change people, or just reveal who they already were? Because in the final scenes, the noise will fade, and what remains will be the truest test of whether anything actually changed. The noise didn't last forever. It never did. After a week, the headlines moved on. The algorithms found something louder, angrier, easier to digest. The video stopped circulating. The comments slowed. The outrage thinned into quiet memory. What remained was harder to measure. Marcus Johnson felt it first in small ways. At the gym, a man he had seen for years but never spoken to nodded and said, "Morning." At work, a supervisor asked his opinion during a meeting instead of talking past him. At a cafe, a barista paused, smiled, and said, "I saw that video, thank you." Marcus accepted these moments without ceremony. He didn't correct anyone, didn't encourage praise, didn't shrink from it either. He simply existed, present, unguarded, the way he always had, but now without the weight of being unseen. Across town, Daniel Whitaker felt the silence differently. The suspension ended. Corporate required additional training. Policy reviews followed. Meetings stretched longer than before. Daniel returned to work, but not to the same role. He no longer wore the security vest. Instead, he worked inventory in the early mornings, when the store was quiet and the lights felt harsher than usual. He accepted the change without complaint. Some coworkers avoided him. Others asked careful questions. Daniel answered them honestly. "I was wrong," he said, "and I'm still learning." One afternoon, the store manager approached him near the loading dock. "Daniel," she said, "corporate is watching how you handle this." Daniel nodded. They should. She studied him. You could have defended yourself. Daniel met her eyes. I defended myself for years. That's how I got here. She didn't argue. A few days later, Marcus returned to the supermarket, not for groceries, but for something else. He walked slowly through the aisles, noticing how different the space felt now that he wasn't being watched. Cameras still existed. Employees still worked. But the tension was gone. At customer service, he asked for the manager. She came quickly, nervous at first. Yes, Mr. Johnson? Marcus smiled faintly. I'm not here to complain. She exhaled. I wanted to ask if you offer first aid training for staff, Marcus continued. If not, I know a program that does. Her expression shifted from concern to interest. We've talked about it, she admitted, but it's never been prioritized. Marcus nodded. It should be. 2 weeks later, the training was scheduled. No press release, no cameras, just people learning. Daniel attended. He sat quietly in the back as Marcus demonstrated techniques, how to check a pulse, how to stabilize someone until help arrived. Marcus's voice was calm, instructional, the same voice that had carried people through their worst moments. Daniel listened, not as someone seeking redemption, but as someone paying attention. After the session ended, Daniel approached Marcus. Thank you, Daniel said, for this. Marcus nodded. People deserve to be helped where they are. Daniel hesitated. I wanted to ask, why didn't you leave that day? Marcus considered the question. Because leaving doesn't fix patterns, Marcus said, and staying doesn't mean accepting them. Daniel nodded slowly. That evening, Marcus received a message from Thomas Reed again. The man thanked him for responding, for listening, for not turning his back on the story. Marcus replied briefly. Take care of your people, he wrote. He meant it. On a quiet Sunday morning, Marcus walked along a neighborhood trail, sunlight filtering through trees. He thought about the years between the accident and the supermarket, about how many times he had helped without being known, about how many times he had been doubted without explanation. The moment in the store hadn't changed who he was. It had changed who people were willing to see, and that mattered. At the supermarket, Daniel began something new. When customers entered, he watched, not their hands, not their bags, but their faces, their movements, their humanity. When something felt off, he asked questions, clear, respectful, transparent. Some customers were surprised, some were relieved. No one was humiliated. One afternoon, a teenage boy lingered nervously near the exit. Daniel approached, not with suspicion, but with calm. You okay? Daniel asked. The boy nodded quickly. Yeah, sorry, Daniel smiled. No need to apologize. The boy relaxed visibly. Daniel felt something settle inside him. This was what change looked like. Not loud, not perfect, but consistent. Weeks later, Marcus and Daniel crossed paths again at the cafe across from the supermarket. They nodded to each other. No awkwardness, no ceremony, just recognition. Daniel raised his coffee slightly. Take care. Marcus nodded. You too. They went their separate ways. That night, Marcus stood on his balcony, city lights stretching out before him. He thought about how easily that day in the supermarket could have ended differently. With anger, with shouting, with someone hurt. Instead, it had ended with truth. And truth, once spoken, tended to stay. If you're listening, stay with this story. Subscribe to the channel and leave a comment. What does real change look like when no one is filming anymore? Because in the final scene, Marcus will choose what this moment becomes in his life. Not a wound, not a victory, but something far more lasting. Marcus Johnson never framed the moment as something that happened to him. He framed it as something that revealed what was already there. Weeks had passed since the supermarket incident. The city had moved on, as cities always do. New stories replaced old ones. New outrage pushed yesterday's discomfort out of view. But Marcus hadn't forgotten. Not because he was holding on to pain, because he was holding on to clarity. On a quiet Saturday morning, Marcus drove along the same stretch of highway where the accident had happened 10 years earlier. The road looked different now. New guardrails, smoother asphalt, brighter signage, but he recognized the curve instantly. He pulled over and stepped out of the car. The air was still, the sound of traffic distant. This was where he had knelt in the rain, where he had broken glass with his bare hands, where he had spoken calmly to a man he did not know and told him to stay awake. Marcus had never wondered what became of that man. He hadn't needed to. Doing the right thing had never required a future reward. He stood there for a moment longer, then got back into his car and drove on. That afternoon, Marcus met with a group of local volunteers at a small community center. No cameras, no recognition, just people learning basic emergency response, asking questions, sharing stories. A young woman raised her hand. "Why do you do this?" Marcus smiled slightly. "Because someone once did it for me." She frowned. "Really?" Marcus nodded. "You don't always know when you're being saved." Across the city, Daniel Whitaker finished his shift and locked his locker. He paused, then removed the old security vest folded neatly on the top shelf. He didn't throw it away. He placed it carefully in a box, not as a reminder of who he had been, but of who he chose not to be again. As he walked out of the store, Daniel noticed a small sign posted near the entrance. New, simple, easy to miss. All customers deserve respect. He stood there for a moment, then nodded to himself and stepped into the evening. Later that night, Marcus received a handwritten note in the mail. No return address. Inside, a single sentence. "Thank you for teaching me that courage doesn't look like control." Marcus folded the note and placed it in a drawer. He didn't respond. Some lessons didn't need replies. As the weeks turned into months, Marcus's life settled back into its familiar rhythm. Work, volunteering, quiet evenings. The supermarket became just another place again. But something invisible had changed. Not the cameras, not the policies, the pauses. People paused before judging, paused before following, paused before assuming. It wasn't perfect, but it was different. One evening, Marcus stood in line at a different grocery store, basket in hand. A security guard glanced at him, then smiled and looked away. Marcus returned the smile, not because he needed it, but because it meant something. If you're listening, thank you for staying with this story. Subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever been judged before you were known? Because sometimes the most powerful stories aren't about being seen as a hero. They're about being recognized as human.